Thanks everybody for joining us for this interesting discussion today about the geopolitics of the internal dynamics of Myanmar. My name is Yun Sun. I'm the director of the China program and the co-director of the East Asia program here at the Stimson Center. And we have had a history of working on issues related to Myanmar, especially Myanmar's relationship with its foreign neighbors for the past decade or so. So for everyone who is joining this session today, I'm sure we're all deeply involved and deeply caring for the development of the country. It has been over 20 months since the military coup provoked a nationwide resistance movement in Myanmar. Over the course of the past almost 2 years, the country has seen fierce fierce development and the crossfire across the country. By one account, the share of Myanmar's townships nationwide engaged in armed resistance grew from 59% in 2020 to 71% in the first half of this year. And the National Unity Government, People's Defense Force, and partnered EAOs, ethnic armed groups, are also engaged in active daily and lethal battles against the military junta. So we hope that the discussion today will unpack what is happening in Myanmar, where the fighting is occurring, what the implications are for the military, for the NUG and the EAOs. So for the discussion today, we have two terrific speakers. Shona Lung is a lecturer and senior researcher in political geography at the University of Zurich. She holds a PhD from the University of Oxford, and her research covers international development, ethnic conflict, and Myanmar. She has been involved in an interesting program with the IISS, I believe, focused on the mapping of the development of armed conflict within the country since the military coup in 2020. And they have done a terrific job collecting the data points about the evolution of the armed conflict. And if you can see the map that they have developed, it is really the most comprehensive reflection of the battlefield development. So I really recommend that you seek out her work. As a discussant today, we have Dr. Zachary Abuza, who has kindly agreed to serve as a discussant. Dr. Abuza is a professor at the National War College here in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on Southeast Asian politics and security issues, including governance, insurgencies, democratization, and human rights, as well as maritime security. Dr. Abuza, I'm sure you're very busy covering that broad range of issues, especially in such a dynamic region such as Southeast Asia. And we know that you also have done a terrific research project on the economic warfare of the potential economic warfare strategy for the NUG down the road. So for everyone who is tuning in today, we also want to put the words in that we will be hosting Professor Abuza next month for the discussion on the NUG's economic warfare strategy. So please do tune in for that event as well. So without further ado, Professor Long, I would like to give you the screen and share with us your observations and your analysis of the battlefield development, the geography of the conflict in Myanmar as we look at it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Yun. I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second. All right. Okay. So again, thank you so much for having me here today. As Yun mentioned, I'm a lecturer in political geography at the University of Zurich, but today I'm talking to you in the capacity of part of a research team that put together the Myanmar Conflict Map as part of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, or the IISS. So the Myanmar Conflict Map was launched in June 2022 as a tool for tracking, visualizing, and analyzing violence in Myanmar. It builds on a database of over 15,000 reports of violence over the last 2 years, collected by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which is better known as ACLED. So the map pulls out of the data specific conflict dynamics, and isolates a set of 6 warscapes, which we hope will provide a framework for understanding what may seem like indistinct violence or conflict from afar. The map is targeted at an international audience, which may not be familiar with the nuances and textures of Myanmar politics. In addition, the conflict map is accompanied by a qualitative analysis of these 6 warscapes, which we have been releasing periodically. So these analyses show how ongoing conflicts are deeply rooted in long-standing political, economic, and social dynamics specific to Myanmar's states and regions. Now, as many people in the audience, I'm sure will know, Myanmar is no stranger to armed conflict. Since the country's independence, no central government has fully controlled the country's peripheries, where armed ethno-nationalist movements have fought for autonomy for decades. But Myanmar's crisis today is also unprecedented. For the first time, over 1 million people are internally displaced. And in some areas, the demands of insurgency and counterinsurgency leave civilians with difficult choices between violence and non-violence, and between principle and self-preservation on a daily basis. Unprecedented too is the sheer number of people who have risen up in various capacities to protest the February 2021 coup. The State Administration Council junta, led by Min Aung Hlaing, immediately faced non-violent resistance on a countrywide scale. Much of the civil service went on strike as part of the civil disobedience movement, crippling basic functions of the state. Street protests attracted tens of thousands of people, most of them young people who had come of age during Myanmar's 10 years of so-called democratization, beginning in 2011. When the Myanmar military suppressed the protests through crackdowns, which cost thousands of lives, opponents of the coup turned to armed resistance. So it is not really possible to provide an in-depth discussion of armed conflict dynamics in a 20-minute or 15-minute talk, let alone do justice to the whole political situation. But today I hope to provide a glimpse into the geography of the resistance movement. And by that, I mean why it is important to understand Myanmar's conflict as divided into 6 warscapes: the dry zone, Rakhine, northeast Myanmar, southeast Myanmar, and northwest Myanmar. And these warscapes as both distinct and interconnected parts of the entire conflict. In many of these warscapes, war had waxed and waned before the coup, albeit in different ways. And the coup therefore introduced new actors and alliances, bringing war to places that were previously untouched by it, while intensifying armed struggles in others. This kind of warscapes approach is not meant to emphasize fragmentation within the resistance, but rather to emphasize its heterogeneity. After all, from my perspective, the struggle over Myanmar's future is as much a struggle against the junta as it is a struggle to reconcile historic divides within Myanmar's diverse population. But to start, we must first speak about different conflict actors. Conflict map classifies actors into 4 groups: SAC forces, anti-SAC forces, and ethnic armed organizations. So SAC forces refer to the junta and its allies, including proxy militias, as well as the Pusoti. The Pusoti are groups of pro-SAC civilians who receive weapons and daily wages from the junta in exchange for reinforcing Tatmadaw attacks. As we can see in this map, the SAC is fighting battles all over Myanmar, and its capabilities are stretched as a result of this, as well as a result of defections, casualties, and a recruitment crisis that it is currently facing. Anti-SAC forces, for us, refer specifically to those formed after the 2021 coup, who are primarily interested in toppling the military regime. So the most prominent set of these are People's Defense Forces, or PDFs, which are small cells of people who opposed the coup using arms, who began to organize on a local basis, using violence against regime soldiers, military-linked infrastructure, and supporters of the regime. Myanmar's shadow government, the National Unity Government, or the NUG, has sought to bring PDFs under a unified chain of command. And over the past year, PDFs in some areas, particularly Chin and Karenni State, have become larger and increasingly organized. At the same time, in other areas like Kachin State and Karen State, PDFs have established relationships with EAOs and have fought alongside them. And thirdly, we have ethnic armed organizations, or EAOs. So these are armed groups that represent non-Burma ethnicities who mostly predate the coup by decades and often control territory close to Myanmar's borders, where they run administrative and political institutions for populations that have limited contact with Myanmar's previous central governments. So in general, many EAOs have stepped up fighting against the SAC since the coup, although their reasons for doing so and their responses to the coup remain varied. In particular, the EAOs have to take into consideration the emergence of PDFs in calculating whether or not to capitalize on this new appetite for armed resistance, or whether to focus on securing autonomy for the specific ethnic groups that they seek to represent. To date, however, it's important to emphasize that no EAOs have fought PDFs. Besides this, this map in particular shows the spatial distribution of violent events unclaimed by any actor. So there have been more than 3,000 incidents of unattributed violence, particularly explosions, since the coup, which encompasses 22% of all violent events. There are likely, in addition to this, to be many events that also go unreported. So we really wanted to show these events on the map because they render visible just how much we do not know about the conflict. And in part, this is to render visible the immense dangers faced by journalists, as well as the junta's use of internet blocks as a counterinsurgency strategy. So for today's talk, I'll talk briefly about 3 warscapes and how SAC forces, anti-SAC forces, and EAOs shape conflict dynamics in each. Nonetheless, you're welcome to ask any questions about any warscapes or any aspects of conflict in Myanmar. So our kind of commentary series began with the dry zone, which is pivotal to the countrywide conflict for 2 reasons. Firstly, the dry zone had not experienced widespread armed violence since Myanmar's independence. Secondly, the dry zone is known as the heart of Burma Buddhism. Its rural Burma Buddhist population was pivotal to the Tatmadaws' claims to preserve Buddhist Burmese nationhood. With the Tatmadaw fighting now against this population, now organized largely as PDFs, the conflict in the dry zone is unsettling the foundations of the Myanmar nation state. One tactic that the SAC has used in the dry zone is the systematic razing of houses suspected to shelter insurgents. This counterinsurgency tactic became widespread from April 2022 onwards and accounts for a large proportion of displacement in Myanmar. So now we see here a map that shows infrastructure destruction, which in the case of this map often refers to the SAC's use of arson, as concentrated in Sagaing, Mandalay, and Magwe. The razing of houses indicates the extent to which the ongoing conflict is blurring the lines between civilian and combatant. Civilian combatant distinctions began to blur early on in May 2021, when civilians took up arms to join PDFs or the Pusoti and attacked those suspected of links to the other side. But the Tatmadaw scorched earth policy has accelerated this process and made it irreversible. By June 2022, the UNHCR reported that 337,000 people had been displaced in Sagaing alone. The SAC's scorched policy is also significant in Myanmar because it was used punitively against EAOs in previous decades when they refused to accede to the Tatmadaw's demands. The SAC is now, of course, using similar tactics against the dry zones population, which illuminates the relationship between the SAC and the Myanmar nation state. In other words, this reveals the SAC to be a class that stands apart from the rest of the Myanmar population, including its Burma Buddhist majority, willing to preserve its grip on power at the expense of lives, livelihoods, and social ties in the country's core. Now, I want to talk briefly about another warscape, Rakhine, where tense calm prevailed after the coup, in contrast to an increase in armed violence everywhere else. The Arakan Army, or the AA, and the Tatmadaw agreed to an informal truce in November 2020, 4 months before the coup, bringing nearly 2 years of intense fighting to an end. The AA at the time was described as the Tatmadaw's most formidable opponent in years. However, an initial absence of conflict in Rakhine was not tantamount to a lack of tension between the Tatmadaw and the AA. Rather, this reflected the AA's relative strength in comparison to other EAOs, and also its determination to chart its own path towards Rakhine sovereignty. Relations between the SAC and the AA are not only poor, but worsening. In our conflict map commentary, we discuss how the AA's responses to the coup has evolved in stages. At first, the NUG and SAC sought to appease the AA, while the AA stance towards them remained consistently ambiguous. It discouraged anti-SAC protests in Rakhine, but released a statement condemning the crackdowns elsewhere in Myanmar. Then, by April 2021, it was clear that the AA was not just equivocating, but rather leveraging the coup to consolidate its internal sovereignty. That month, the AA announced that it was entering a new revolutionary phase, turning from military matters to implementing strong public institutions. Thereafter, in January this year, the AA began to make more elaborated bids for outside actors' recognition. They gave 2 rare interviews to the English language press, stating the AA was open to seeing if NUG's vision for federal Myanmar could encompass its ambitions. Finally, in late July, conflict returned to Rakhine. The AA's Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Dr. Neo Tuang Ong, has described this as a final war for building the state of Arakan. The conflict in Rakhine has marched to a different beat than in the rest of Myanmar, and it illustrates both the strengths of cartographic representations like the conflict map, as well as their limits. So on one hand, the conflict map shows how, when conflict was flaring up elsewhere in Myanmar, Rakhine remained staunchly calm. But on the other hand, the map must be accompanied by careful contextual analyses, which pays heed to the AA's history and aims vis-a-vis other EAOs. The situation in Rakhine shows that Myanmar's countrywide conflict is not just about overthrowing the junta, but about competing formats for political and territorial sovereignty. Conversely, and finally, in Southeast Myanmar, armed conflict flared up almost immediately after the coup. The Southeast is notable and distinctive because of its close relationship between the NUG, PDFs, and local EAOs, namely the Karen National Union, or KNU, and the Karenni National Progressive Party, or KNPP. Both were among the first to denounce the coup and to match their words with military action, as well as to openly support the NUG. The KNU and KNPP are also remarkable for their extensive cooperation with proximate People's Defense Forces, training them, supplying them, and in the KNU's case, incorporating them under a system of joint command. The cooperation between EAOs and Myanmar's democratic resistance has had a long history in the Southeast. There is no time to do justice to this here. Suffice to say that current events are reminiscent of the 1980s and 1990s, when the Tatmadaws crackdown on the pro-democracy 8888 uprising drove 5,000 protesters into EAO-controlled areas in the Southeast. This made the KNU's headquarters at Manipur the epicenter not just of the Karen resistance, which had persisted since Myanmar's independence, but of Burma's exiled democracy movement. New alliances were formed at this time between Burma activists and stalwart EAO officials. However, tensions soon emerged between democracy activists and the southeastern EAOs with whom they sought refuge. Some democracy activists did not sympathize with the EAO's aspirations for self-determination and their insistence on armed struggle as a means for achieving it. But the Tatmadaw ultimately dealt the final blow to this nascent alliance. In 1995, a KNU splinter group, the DKBA, joined hands with the Tatmadaw and overran Manipur, the headquarters of both the KNU and the democracy movement at the time. Subsequent attacks severely weakened the KNU, which signed a bilateral ceasefire in 2012 and 2015, and the NCA in 2015. The KNPP signed a bilateral ceasefire in 2012 too. However, both the KNU and KNPP ceasefires, as well as the NCA, proved ineffective at addressing the political grievances of both Karen and Karenni communities. In 2021, the anti-coup movement and the rise of NUG and the PDFs alongside offered the KNU and KNPP the chance to once again participate in countrywide struggle for federal democracy. While cooperation has not been frictionless, the close cooperation between EAOs and other anti-SAC actors distinguishes the Southeast from other warscapes in Myanmar. This borderland is critical not only to the KNU and KNPP, but to the arduous task of once again interweaving various groups' enduring struggles for democracy and self-determination. I'd like to conclude with some general reflections on what taking apart these warscapes and then putting them back together can tell us about Myanmar. So firstly, by dividing actors into 4 groups, SAC, anti-SAC, EAOs, and unattributed actors, and showing how they act in different configurations, the conflict map seeks to make clear that the current war is not strictly a binary contest between the SAC and anti-SAC forces. Keeping the varied aspirations and challenges of these actors in mind, we feel allows for a clear assessment of conflict in Myanmar. It recognizes Myanmar's demographic and geographic diversity, as well as how the current struggle is not just about overthrowing the coup, but about how to accommodate deep divisions in society, which often themselves were the product of the Tatmadaws' divide and rule strategies. Secondly, by displaying changes in the type of violent events over time, the conflict map tracks the evolution of the conflict, which makes clear that the SAC does not and has not had a foothold over most of Myanmar. Since October 2021, Myanmar has witnessed above 900 violent events each month, predominantly armed clashes and remote explosions. The conflict has notably not abated over the rainy season. Thirdly, a deep dive into each warscape shows that Myanmar is not, as narratives of a failed state would show, a zone of undifferentiated chaos. There are deep-rooted reasons why groups struggle against the state in various ways, which must be addressed. Calls for the cessation of violence, as various international actors have put it, fall flat because they do not address the root causes of violence, which stretch far further back than the coup in 2021. These root causes are, again, differentiated by geography, but also extremely interrelated. And finally, by drawing attention to the varied and entrenched roots of the conflict in Myanmar, the conflict map seeks to show that decades-old disagreements and tensions cannot be overcome in mere months. Nonetheless, people have taken to the streets in historic numbers. It is important to keep both of these facts in mind. Both the difficulties of forging alliances in a country where divisions have long existed and long been exploited by the Tatmadaw, as well as the unprecedented unity that has fomented against the SAC today. So I hope this was helpful and that the map is insightful and helpful for you as well. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much, Shona. Thank you for that very succinct and also comprehensive presentation about the conflict dynamic in the country. It is indeed a complicated matter with deep historical roots, which has been complicated by the civil-military contest for power, for legitimacy, and especially the development since the coup. And hearing you out about this conflict dynamic cannot help but wonder that is the country being governed at all, that the SAC in fact has any ability to lead the country forward, or we're just watching the country, as some would say, crash and burn. And what is the end game, and what are we looking at towards the next, say, 3 to 5 years? So with that question in mind, I'd like to invite Professor Abuza to share with us his observation and his comments about Shona's study. Professor Abuja has been following the conflict dynamic in the country for a number of years now, and he has produced some of the most insightful analysis on this topic. So Professor Abuja, without further ado. Oh, I think you are muted.
You'd think I'd learned by now. Thank you very much for having me. Let me begin with my 2 disclaimers. The first is I am here in my personal capacity. I am not representing the Department of Defense or the National War College. And second, I am actually not a Myanmar specialist, but I am someone that has studied political violence, insurgency, insurgent financing and logistics, and peace processes in Southeast Asia for over 30 years. So I come at this with some comparative perspective. Let me begin by commending Dr. Leung and her outstanding series. She has done brilliant work across 4 very distinct battlefronts so far, with 2 more to go. Her studies provide ample historical context to set up the post-coup period where she delves into, and she's very judicious in her analysis of the interests and capabilities of the different actors out there, whether they be the SAC, their militias, the EROs, or the PDFs affiliated with the National Unity Government. Maintaining a data set of that magnitude is a thankless job. And she really deserves credit with her team for maintaining this. There is always a dearth of information coming out of conflict zones, especially in a country as large as Myanmar with such limited resources for the media and control over the media. And, she really does a fantastic job in trying to smooth out the data so that it's presented in such an important and thorough way. I really, if you do not read her analyses, you really should. IISS and ACLED and her team also deserve commendation for putting together, as you saw, such a rich, data-driven, visual multimedia piece. It really is effective. It brings home when you're talking about the offensives in the dry zone, where you see the concentration of what 30,000 razed homes really looks like. So again, the team has done a fantastic job. Dr. Leung's work also supports recent analyses such as the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar, which tried to map effective control in the country. And their recent report really shows that the NUG and their affiliated PDFs and the EROs have effective control of roughly half the country. The military's effective control is down to about 17%. So that kind of gets to some of the questions that Yoon raised right at the end. Now, what Dr. Leung and others have clearly demonstrated is that across the country, there are 330 townships, over half have experienced armed conflict. So the war is very real for the people of Myanmar. These are no longer remote conflicts there. So let me just, I don't have time to go into all of her 4 different case studies that she's gone over, and I thought she did a great job talking about the dry zone. Of the other studies, let me just mention that Rakhine is the place where there's the most at play right now. At the time of her writing, you were really, there were assumptions about the state of the peace or the ceasefire that are just not holding now. A lot of us kind of wondered, are you kidding? Can the Tatmadaw really afford a new front against a 33,000 man army that has kept their powder dry for the past 2 years? And are they really that dumb? And at the end of the day, the Tatmadaw simply cannot countenance a group like the Arakan armies push for autonomy and potentially independence. And I think this is the one battlefield that we're looking at that might be tactical, but with strategic consequences for the rest of the country. She does a great job covering the Southeast. The Northeast, there was not a time for her to discuss, but let me just mention that if you remove the Kachin region, man, the Shan states are an absolute mess. And from my vantage point, we and analysts out there really ignore what a mess it is and ignore the complexity of it, and we do so at our peril. Right now, there are simply too many groups out there, pro-junta, those who favor the status quo, pro-NUG-ish. But from my vantage point, what we really see is the majority are benefiting from the status quo. There is simply too much money coming out of Shan states in the illicit narcotic trade right now. And I think any of us who think that the NUG have an ability to actually win over core support in Shan State, it's very naive. And in other places, they've been able to at least secure a working relationship, if not an alliance, such as with the Arakan army. Now, I want to reiterate her point, and that is that she is not describing a fragmentation of the resistance. She is really trying to show that there are these distinct conflict zones. They are interrelated, but they all have their own dynamics and the conflict dynamics there. And her report is very nuanced, and I hope we appreciate the degree of nuance in them. Let me just talk very briefly about what this means for the Tatmadaw. The first is the Tatmadaws never had to fight a multiple front war, certainly not on this scale, and it's clearly posing challenges to their logistics and operations. Supply lines now go through the Bama heartland, and they're being targeted. They never had to worry about logistics outside of the immediate border zones before, and they really are right now. Road networks in some regions, such as the Chin State, which I know that she will cover in her follow-up reports in the Northwest, are very vulnerable. And we're seeing a growing reliance on waterine logistics networks, even though those are increasingly being targeted by PDFs. For the Tatmadaw, we don't have firm figures, but we're looking at probably about 15% casualties. If you are simply thinking about the door trigger pullers, the people, the combatants, not the rear service, not the Navy, not the Air Force, but boots on the ground, that's actually 15% is making a real dent. When you look at the 12 different light infantry divisions, we know that they are desperately undermanned. Their battalions are probably running at about half the manpower that they are ideally established or set up for. And we know that they're tired. Any military will tell you that 3 to 4 months of nonstop operations, it will push you and destroy your battlefield efficacy. And I think we're really seeing that. Recruitment, Dr. Leung mentioned, is already an issue. We know they're lowering standards. We know they're increasing enlistment bonuses. We know that they're trying to tap into new pools, even forcing police into frontline military duty. Conscription will be an imperative for them. What we don't know is the degree of training those new conscripts will get. Are they upping the tempo, and will we see a real decline in battlefield efficacy of the military moving forward? It's something anyone who's looking at Russia right now would be paying a lot of attention to. We also know that they're increasingly reliant on very poorly disciplined militias, and that's always a tell. And sadly, because of the economic collapse of the country, militia recruitment is getting easier for the junta. So I think we've got to think about what that means across her conflict landscape. In terms of defections, we know about them. What we don't know as much about are desertions. We've been not seeing those large-scale defections, entire units right now, but they're starting to happen. We're still seeing individuals defect, and largely this is because of the coercive measures at the military's disposal. Soldiers live on cantonments. All their money is in military-owned banks. The families work for military-owned corporations. Their cell phone communications are being monitored because they all use MeTel. So those things are important. When you start to get unit-level defections, that's the real tell that morale is through the floor. A few weeks ago, we saw an entire unit disobey orders, so that's starting to happen right now. We're also seeing greater reliance on air power and artillery. This is all very indiscriminate. Gravity bombs. The Tatmadaw's artillery corps are not known for their accuracy or discipline. Their artillery is there for counter value, not counter force. They've never had to worry about counter battery operations. So that is a real problem. And let me just conclude with a couple quick points, and that is, you can imagine that the military that for almost 60 years has been able to use their four-cut strategy to absolutely terrorize the population into submission. And that's not working now, right? Across the country, across all the battlefronts that Dr. Leung describes in great detail, you are seeing incredible courage and determination to stand up to flat out sheer terror on the part of state and security forces, the intentional targeting of civilians across there. We know that the leadership is getting frustrated. They're very concerned that 20 months in, they are losing ground. We are already seeing the rotation of generals within the SAC, replacing them with younger, more psychotic sycophants. Operational unit commanders are now being recalled. Just this week, an LID battalion leader, a colonel, was recalled, lost his job. So these are the frontline troops. And so you're starting to see that frustration on the part of the SAC leadership. And so I think moving forward, we're going to start to see some different dynamics in the battlefield. And I, for one, really look forward to Dr. Long's future studies and some updates on the current ones. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Abuza, for your very insightful comments. While you did mention the question of the fragmentation of the resistance, I think it really depends on which perspective you're looking at, right? Well, fragmentation is not a new phenomenon in Myanmar, and we have seen this for 7 decades. But I think from a different perspective, you could also argue that this is the most united among the resistance that we have seen for a very long time in history. So it's a matter of, I guess, a matter of relevance and degrees. So we have a lot of questions coming in. I'll refrain from asking my own questions, which I actually have a lot. I think going through the questions, I think the first question posted to Professor Long and also Professor Abuza for your comments is really the question of Shan State. And we touched upon this before our session started a little bit as well. I think the question is focused on, one, what explains the relative low level or the lack of conflicts in Shan State? Because if you look at the map, the majority of the Shan State seems to have been spared by this escalation of armed conflicts in the country. And secondly, as a part related to that question, are there any difference in the goals of the armed ethnic groups or the actors in Shan State compared to the rest of the country? We know that Shan State is like Professor Abuza mentioned, is distinct, is different from the rest of the country. So any comments that you would like to share on that particular angle? Maybe we will start with Professor Long.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I suppose the first thing to say about Shan State is that, I mean, I do think there is quite a significant amount of conflict there. But of course, there are some areas in Shan State where conflict isn't present. And that's largely because of the existence of kind of sub-enlisted zones that were either kind of guaranteed at the constitution or informally accorded to some ethnic armed organizations. However, I think for us looking at Shan State, and I think maybe this links to both questions, whether or not there are differences in the goals of armed actors, as well as relative kind of absence or presence of conflict in Shan State, we have to look at the area's kind of history. And one thing that I suppose I've been thinking about in relation to Shan State is that it's not adequate to look to the coup as a turning point. We really have to go back further into history to try and understand why this area is so confounding. And for that, I suppose I have two answers that come to mind. Firstly, I think the first one is the Tatmadaws' reliance, not just since the coup, but for many decades, reliance on militias as a counterinsurgency strategy in Shan State. So many of the ethnic armed organizations that we see there today have their origins as kind of Tatmadaw proxy militias or as kind of groups that splintered from other groups. And that to me is the clearest kind of sign of the Tatmadaws' divide and rule kind of strategy. And so groups have always kind of been in a position where they are struggling for autonomy and for survival, especially given resource dynamics in the area, as opposed to seeking kind of alliances or seeking kind of a countrywide movement. I think the second thing to be taken into consideration is the role of China and the China border in Shan State. And here, I think from the perspective of different armed groups, there are different kind of priorities in mind, right? This isn't to armed groups a kind of against the junta or not against the junta thing. You have to weigh kind of, again, in the context of seeking survival, weighing kind of relations with other armed groups and how that will be perceived by China in order to ensure that they will still be able to operate as they always have. So, so I'm not sure if this kind of answers the question directly, but I hope that gives some insight into the area. That I'm sure, Professor Abuza, you have much more to add.
Absolutely. Professor Abuza, please.
As I said before, I mean, in the area, you're going to have groups that are pro-junta, that are pro-status quo, and a very small group that are kind of pro-NUG. And I think the majority are benefiting from the status quo. What I would say is the real difference in Shan states is that you don't see a lot of SAC ERO violence, between the junta and the ethnic resistance organizations. Unfortunately, there, what you see is a lot of intra conflict between the different organizations there. So while other regions are making progress and trying to put the Tatmadaw on their back heels, you just don't see it in Shan states.
I tend to agree, especially the factor of China. I think for a lot of the EAOs along the China border, there is a prioritization almost for the local stability and especially the border tranquility. And I think that does translate into certain pressure on groups such as UWSA. While we talk about AA as the most consequential player, for a very long time, UWSA was. So I think the Shan state definitely shows some interesting dynamic. And related to that question, actually, there are a couple of other questions that is also relevant for this discussion. So I want to post them here. From a counterinsurgency or insurgency point of view, I'm sure Professor Abuja, you know this very well. Whether this insurgency is homegrown or has foreign support actually means a lot for the sustainability of the resistance or the insurgency. And in the case of Myanmar, we have seen that the SAC trying to strengthen their relationship with Russia. We've seen General Min Aung have paid several trips to visits to Moscow to solicit military assistance. Do you think that makes a difference in terms of the battlefield development? And also, given what Russia is experiencing in the Ukraine front, that inevitably will have to have an impact over what they can offer, right? And then there's also the question of China. China so far, I would say, has kept quite aloof or distant from the escalation of the conflicts within the country. And in your paper, you discuss the potential economic warfare strategies of NUG. But so far, question for both of you: do you see that the Chinese assets in the country being targeted or potentially being targeted by this massive resistance movement? So basically a question for the foreign player or the foreign influence in the resistance. And Professor Abuja, maybe we'll start with you this time.
So I think it would be foolhardy for any group to target the Chinese-owned pipelines across the country. That the Chinese would not look kindly upon that. We have seen the PDFs target the gas pipeline into Thailand. And that could be hit. Again, the Thais don't have the leverage that the Chinese do. Look, other Chinese assets and in the country are very well guarded. And I think there's a real concern that should the regime not protect Chinese economic interests, that the Chinese will intervene and put pressure on the junta in many other ways. They have many tools at their disposal in terms of supporting the KIA, the United Wa State Army, etc. Let me quickly touch the Russia piece. Yes, I think Min Aung Hlaing has gone several times. He's looking for diplomatic support. He certainly is interested in weapons and munitions which are being expended. But I would agree with Yun that Russia is no position right now to supply anyone at the rate they are going through munitions, losing munitions, and the need to recapitalize their own forces. So I'm just not seeing that. I think the economic ties are more interesting, and that is the support for or the sale of oil at subsidized prices the sale of fertilizer, which Myanmar really needs right now, and all of this that can be done through a non-US dollar exchange. We've seen Myanmar banks set up office in Russia, and so they're looking to do deals in rubles or chat or some other swap to avoid US dollars because both countries are so sanctioned.
Thank you, Professor Abuja. I wonder, Professor Long, Shona, you have any care to share some comments?
To be honest, thank you, Professor Abuja. I think you provided much more context than I could have. Just want to clarify also in terms of where I'm coming from. I'm definitely not an expert in kind of Myanmar's international relations. I can try my best to give some reflections, but that's really not my area of expertise. And that's something that I want to be quite clear about, because I think when we talk about conflict, I mean, no one really entirely understands every aspect of the conflict, and I certainly don't. And I think it's important to be kind of honest about those limitations.
No worries. And we have a question that's right in your alley, which is about the methodology of the mapping of the conflict. I'm sure you have been asking this question repeatedly. So the questions are, what are the sources of the map's data, and what are the parameters to shift through the data and multiple reports? So do you prioritize any sources? I remember asking this question to IISS in Singapore, that how are those data points being collected, and how to evaluate their accuracy and their timeliness? I'm sure this is a question that you have dealt with a lot.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It is a question that we get a lot, but also for good reason. I suppose the first thing I'll say is that much thanks for the kind of original data goes to ACLED. Ideally, would have been able to collect data by ourselves, but that of course would be a huge undertaking, and there just wasn't the resources to do that. So how this works is that ACLED has kind of scours through media reports every month to look for kind of distinct conflict events, which it then puts through a review system. So you can find out more about the review system on ACLED's website. But the reason why we chose ACLED as opposed to other conflict databases is because we knew that they were looking at both English language media, Burmese media, as well as ethnic media. So we felt that however imperfect any data set is, and this is certainly also an imperfect data set, it was still the best possible representation of conflict at the time. But now I can also take you through what we did with that data. So how ACLED data looks is that there's simply kind of a long spreadsheet of every 15,000 events that have happened and the actors that they are attributed to, and whether or not we know the names of those actors, or if we only know if this event occurred. And what our team had to do is to categorize this information, right? So and especially categorize it for, because ACLED's data simply names different groups, but it doesn't categorize them as kind of Tatmadaw or SAC or anti-SAC or EAOs. So that's where the contextual analysis comes in, where we have to say, okay, we know that this is an EAO, we know that this is a group formed after the coup, and therefore making sense of this big set of data. Another thing we did with ACLED data, so ACLED data also categorizes events into different subtypes, if you like. So for instance, one subtype it uses is the category mob violence. And this category is one that doesn't have much meaning in the Myanmar context. Firstly, because in the discourse around Myanmar, it's not often used, and we wanted to use words that reflected the discussion or the debate around Myanmar. But secondly, because when you look at what is in this kind of type, mob violence, often it refers to what you and I would call a crackdown on protesters. And that has a very different connotation to mob violence. It really indicates this asymmetrical nature of the state versus peaceful protesters, which is why we looked at these different subtypes and categorized it into, I guess, our own Myanmar specific types that we felt were like more legible to an audience interested in Myanmar. So using words that were familiar in media coverage, but B, also recognize the asymmetry between the Tatmadaw or the SAC and kind of other groups in the country. The final thing I will say also is that there were some things that we chose to exclude for various reasons. So one, ACLED does kind of record kind of events of sexual violence. And I agree that this is an incredibly important and systemic part of the conflict in Myanmar. However, we also know that sexual violence is incredibly underreported. right? So because ACLED uses media reports, whatever comes through the data will be a huge underestimate of the magnitude and breadth of sexual violence in the country. And as a result, we don't show it on the map because we think that including that would be misleading. And instead, it's better to approach sexual violence as a systemic issue as opposed to something that you can plot. So just to give you some insight into how we were thinking about this.
Very interesting, very interesting. Yeah, I think data collection coming to Myanmar is always a challenge for all the researchers, right? Well, especially given that now with a coup, you can't really visit the country. So unfortunately, the dependence on the secondhand data is inevitable in this case. But hopefully, hopefully we'll be able to return to the region at some point. There are a couple of questions about China, and since I've been following that quite closely, I'll just share some of my observation. There's a question about China's interaction with different groups in Myanmar, China's discussion with NUG, and the EAOs like the AA. To my knowledge, the Chinese are trying to keep a distance from the resistance, at least publicly, because on the official level, China still regards SAC as a de facto government of the country. Whether they publicly recognize its legitimacy is a question subject to debate, because they have issued official invitation for the foreign minister of the SAC to visit China, and he was addressed as a foreign minister. So it does convey indirect or tacit recognition, but formal recognition of the legitimacy of the SAC has not really come through. I understand that there are interactions between China and NUG on the working level, meaning that Chinese diplomats and Chinese representatives outside the country have had interactions and meetings with the NUG. But to my knowledge, the recognition of NUG's legitimacy has not happened either. In terms of EAOs, I think Chinese are holding the EAOs along the China-Myanmar border in almost a hold state, that not to adopt any hasty conclusions or positions, either recognize SAC or oppose SAC. So it's more of a status quo. AA does not operate directly on the Chinese border. So any influence that China exercises over AA is through groups like UWSA along the Chinese border and the KIA to the extent that China could. The BRI investment in Myanmar, because of the COVID situation in China and the strict COVID restrictions, it has been very difficult for the Chinese SOEs and Chinese companies to advance the development of CMEC project. And according to what I have been following, most recently in late August, the Chinese only started to initiate the process of public hearings. For example, the environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment of the Jiaopiu deep sea port. And I haven't seen specific development in Myanmar about the China-Myanmar high-speed railway, although the construction in the China portion within the Yunnan province, that has been advancing quite smoothly. But then the question is, well, if you build a railway to the China-Myanmar border, where does that go? So it really begs the question. But I would say that the instability and the potential political turmoil, or the actual current political turmoil in Myanmar, has made the Chinese rather hesitant about their further investment in the country. So hopefully that answers the China question. And we have about 6 minutes left, and I'd like to pose this question, that I think this question actually is almost a theme that resonates through the discussion today, which is the reconciliation between the ethnic groups and the Burma resistance groups. Because I think we all understand that EAOs, their aspiration is different from the Burma-dominated, for example, the NUG or the Burma-dominated PDFs. So some would say that the power struggle is within the Burma group. It's an intra-Burma competition for power. That, for example, the NLD and the SACs, the NLD and the military, they're essentially all Burma. But where does EAO really stand to gain in this struggle? And some more cynical EAOs would say that eventually this is a war within the Burma groups. How does EAOs really gain from such a political struggle or armed struggle? So the question is that, do we see the ethnic groups and anti-ICC Burma groups really try to reconcile their political and historical differences? Earlier on, there was a version of a potential new constitution that would address this problem being circulated. But there are also different attitudes from the different groups as for whether that approach is really acceptable. So I think that's the essential question for the future of the country, that this is not just a political reconciliation process between the military and the democratic forces. This is also ethnic reconciliation process between the Burma majority and the ethnic minorities. But when we weave these two tracks together, it comes with so many different challenges and different variations of the challenge. So I wonder whether Shona and Professor Abuja, whether you have any observation or any insights to share about this particular question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. I mean, to me, I think this is a key question to the about Myanmar and its future, and very key in this current juncture, as well as for many, many years. But I think the first thing I want to say is that we have to be very careful about what we mean by reconciliation. So does reconciliation mean that kind of everybody gets along and agrees on everything? Or, and this is the second view is what I'm more inclined towards, a society in which there are differences and there are tensions, but these differences and tensions have kind of channels in which they can be articulated, in which they can be worked through, and in which, you know, it does not necessarily erupt into kind of violence on the scale that we've seen in Myanmar for many years. And I think this distinction is very, very important to make, because, you know, sometimes when I follow the media, I see news kind of about certain groups maybe disagreeing with how the NUG does things. And then the comment after that is, oh no, has the NUG failed? And I think there is a logical leap between these two things, because I think the fact that grievances are aired is actually a positive thing. It just is a matter of how we deal with those differences. And so this comes back to the question of, you know, what does reconciliation mean? And then I suppose secondarily, are we striving for kind of an idealized perfection that we've imposed on, that maybe international actors expect out of Myanmar, when even I would say your own societies don't reflect kind of that level of cohesion and harmony? And so do I think that the current resistance movement will allow for ethnic reconciliation? I think it is an unprecedented kind of opportunity in the history of Myanmar, right? So compared to previous eras in Myanmar's history, there is a better opportunity for people to voice grievances and to articulate self-determination than ever before. Do I think this is perfect? No, but I also think that this lack of perfection is part of the journey and in fact, incredibly necessary. Because when we look back also at Myanmar's history of using the word unity and so on, that has always meant kind of violence against minorities. So there has to be a kind of reconciliation that accommodates violence and disagreements and tensions without allowing it to kind of lapse into armed conflict. I also just want to briefly say a word to a question that we may not get time to, which is about Rohingya. I think this is also a very, very crucial part of this process. And at the moment, that is something, to be honest, I don't know if I see a solution for. Again, I think there have been statements made that were unprecedented, but will the AA or will the NUG be as open to Rohingya as perhaps I wish for? I really don't know the answer to that question. And I think that there are still very deep divisions on that. And I think it's important also to be honest about this and yeah, think about a way forward.
Thank you. That's a terrific answer. How about Zach? What do you think?
Look, the NUG has on offer, you know, in terms of what their political vision of the country is, the best hope for the different EROs and having regional autonomy. And I think that's why they've been able to win over as much support as they have. There are two problems that we need to focus on with this, though, and that is, can they actually deliver? Will they put in place the constitutional framework that they have promised these ethnic resistance organizations? And they've really got to start on that right now. This is not something that can wait until later. You've got to start the post-war planning now across the board. The second thing is that the relationship right now between the NUG and the different EROs is as good as it's been in history. But remember, there's still bad blood and a lot of mistrust between those groups and the Bama-dominated NUG. At the end of the day, many of them will act in their own self-interests. The other part of that is that the military understands that the strength of the NUG right now is that network of alliances and partnerships. That is their center of gravity. And you can bet that the SAC is throwing everything they have. Just today, you have peace talks in Naypyidaw with different groups. They keep on trying to buy these groups off, win them over, and eventually they are going to succeed with some. And so if the conflict is protracted, goes on for years and years, that really gives the SAC a lot of opportunity to peel away support from those EROs. And yeah.
Absolutely, divide and conquer, a eternal strategy of the Burmese military of the Tatmadaw, and we've seen this repeatedly historically. Okay, well, before we wrap up, and thank you so much for sharing your insights. Last question came from David Steinberg, who is like the godfather of Burma studies. So I feel that we have to talk about his question, which is about arming the NUG. There have been proposals being circulated in the policy community that foreign governments should provide arms to NUG or opposition groups. I wonder, what do you think about that? Is that a good idea, or is that going to be a hazard and with significant cost being imposed? What do you think? Again, your personal opinion, personal observation does not represent any official position. Zach, I wonder whether you can share your thought about that.
I believe that the NUG deserves to be armed by the United States and other international actors. I think they are a legitimate government. I think they have a just cause. I think they have sufficient command and control. That said, it's not going to happen. There is absolutely no stomach for it in the US government. The DoD is preoccupied and they are not interested in this. Myanmar is too tangential to core US interests. The Drug Enforcement Agency is largely able to convince a lot of the interagency process that too many of the EROs are involved in the drugs trade. We can't touch that. We cannot start arming these groups. So it's not going to happen. And I think it's wrong, but it's not going to happen. I have talked in previous settings and writings that there are many other things the United States government can and should do. Everything from Starlink to recognizing the NUG to new rounds of sanctions, secondary sanctions. I can think of so many other things we can do for the NUG that are short of lethal assistance. And frankly, I'm disappointed we're not doing more. Last point is, not being armed by the United States is not necessarily a bad thing for the NUG in terms of their legitimization. No one in the SAC can say you're a stooge, you're a puppet of the Americans, you're being armed. This is homegrown, and you know they're doing a decent job in building up their arsenal. It's not easy to do what they've been able to do. Their logistics supply is taxed, but they deserve credit.
Terrific, terrific, really awesome comment. David, I hope that answers the question. Shona, any last words on this question or others?
No, just thank you so much for coming in for all the questions. I also learned a lot today, so thank you.
Well, the gratitude is absolutely mine. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join this discussion. We covered a lot of ground, and the figuring out the answers to the Burma question, I think it has taken generations of people's wisdom, and we certainly will continue to work hard on this front. So please stay tuned for our continued discussion on Myanmar, and our event next month will feature Zach in terms of his proposal about economic warfare and strategies that NUG could consider. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I hope that you have a good day and have a good evening, and hopefully you will join us again for our future discussions on Myanmar.